Story 1. The New Guy in the Neighborhood. A few years back, I moved into the house I'm living in now. At the time, it was a new development. It was one of those places where they planned to fill up the street with homes, but so far, it was just me and one other house across the street and a couple of lots down. The rest were just empty lots, which gave the whole street a kind of eerie, unfinished feel. One night, shortly after I moved in, I was reading a book in my bedroom when I decided to go to the kitchen to grab a drink of water. As I was drinking, I glanced out the front window and noticed some light coming from the direction of the neighbor's house. I hadn't met the neighbor yet, but knew that someone lived there. I joked to my friends that I was the new guy in the neighborhood, even though it was just me and the person across the street. Peering through the window, I could just make out a car parked outside, and what looked like a figure standing at the front door. It was too dark, and the figure was too far away to see any details, but I assumed it was my neighbor. I watched for a short time, but after little activity, I didn't think much of it, finished my water, and headed back to bed. Back in my room, I dove back into my book, but after about 5 minutes or so, a noise from the front of the house caught my attention. It was a subtle sound at first, so I brushed it off and tried to focus on my reading. I figured I was imagining things, telling myself that these new houses sometimes settle and make strange noises. But the noise didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. I rationalized to myself that it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon. Feeling a mix of annoyance and unease, I got up to check it out. I crept down the hallway, not wanting to turn on the lights just yet, thinking maybe I could catch a glimpse of what it was. I angled myself at my front window to try to get a look at my front door, but it was too dark to see anything. As I backed away from the window, though, I looked back over at my neighbor's house. The car was still there, but the person at the front door was gone. That's when the noise at my door got louder, more insistent. It had to be a raccoon, I thought to myself. I quietly inched my way over to the door. Without thinking much further, I switched on the porch light and yanked the door open at the same time, ready to confront a small animal. But it wasn't a raccoon. It was a man, right there on my doorstep, his hand frozen midair, reaching for my screen door. We locked eyes, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The guy looked rough, wild-eyed, and desperate, like he was running on something more than just adrenaline. He had a look of surprise on his face, as I'm sure I did as well. Both of us stood there, as if each of us was calculating our next move. Suddenly, he reached for the screen door and started shaking it violently, as if he had made his decision and was trying to tear it open. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my chest, and yelled through the door that I was calling the cops. As I backpedaled, I could see him through the window, running into the front yard, pausing for a second as if considering his options, then running back to the car in the neighbor's driveway. It was then that I realized that the car and man across the street wasn't my neighbor, but a man trying to get into my neighbor's house. I called the police, and they came out pretty quickly, but by then, the guy was long gone. They took my statement and did a quick check around the house and the neighbors. The man, whoever it was, had broken into my neighbor's house and then made his way over to mine. I would later find out that luckily, my neighbor wasn't at home and was on vacation at the time. The cops said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I never got word back that the man had been caught. I installed some extra locks and a security system after that. I even met the neighbors when they got back. We talked about the incident, and they were as shaken up about it as I was. Like me, they installed cameras to beef up the security around their property. Since that time, the neighborhood has grown now. Most of the lots have been developed, and it feels more like a community than it did before, when it was just my neighbor and me. That night was a terrifying night to say the least, and I'm just glad that no one got hurt. It was an experience that I'll never forget, and so far, it is the only bad one I've ever had in my new home. Hopefully it stays that way. Story 2. Footprints. Moving into my first house in my early 20s was a dream come true. I'd spent most of my young adult life in a cramped apartment, so having an actual house, with a yard for Max, my faithful four-legged companion, felt like a breath of fresh air. Max, a hefty German shepherd with a usually calm demeanor, was my sidekick since college. but from day one in the new place, he acted odd, sniffing around and looking over his shoulder like some invisible boogeyman was always behind him. I chalked it up to the new environment. After all, dogs need time to adjust, I thought to myself. A few days in, my buddy Jeff invited me over for drinks. It was a good chance to relax and let Max play with Jeff's dog. We had a blast, but as the afternoon wore on, storm clouds began to rumble in the distance. The last thing I wanted to do was get caught in a big storm on the road back to my house, so we said our goodbyes and headed for home. Max and I didn't leave soon enough. A few miles from home, the sky cracked open and rain began pouring down. Nevertheless, we made it home. Once inside, Max's behavior shifted. He sniffed the air and growled, a deep guttural sound that set my nerves on edge. The house felt different, charged with a static kind of tension, but I convinced myself it was just the storm messing with us. Max's ears, though, were pointed straight up, and his gaze was pinned to the top of the stairs. "It's okay, boy," I said to him. "It's just the storm." But he didn't flinch. He was locked onto the top of the stairs. Wanting to put him at ease, and myself as well, I kicked off my shoes and made my way up the stairs. I guess in my mind, I would walk upstairs, flip on the lights, show Max that there was nothing to be alarmed at, and that would put him at ease. But as I climbed the stairs, I noticed they were wet. Puzzled, I ran my hand along the wall, searching for a leak, but it was dry. I looked up at the ceiling as well, but didn't see any leaks there either. Reaching the top, I found more water. This didn't make any sense. Max's growling intensified, and my heart started thumping under my shirt. Something wasn't right. As I looked at the water at the top of the steps, I noticed something. It wasn't pooled together in a puddle. It was spread out, like water from footsteps. Suddenly, I began to feel incredibly uneasy as my mind began putting two and two together. "Hello?" I called out, mostly hoping that I wouldn't receive an answer. That's when the commotion started, a loud crash from one of the two bedrooms, like someone knocking over furniture in a hurry. Max barked furiously, charging ahead of me. My heart hit another gear, pounding intensely as I realized that Max and I weren't alone in our new home. As Max darted in, I motioned toward the bedroom doorway, just in time to catch the tail end of someone swinging out of my second-story window, vanishing into the rain-soaked night. Adrenaline surged, and I sprinted downstairs, fumbling with my phone to dial 911. As I waited for the operator, I noticed wet footprints on the kitchen floor, leading from the back door, which was slightly cracked open. Panic gripped me as I thought about the fact that someone had broken into my new home. I was both angry and terrified at the same time. The police arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The perpetrator was gone. They took my statement, snapping pictures of the footprints and the disheveled state of the upstairs bedroom. I felt violated, my sanctuary breached by some stranger. Weeks passed, and Max finally began to settle into our new home. Although still somewhat on edge, I too began to settle in and find peace there. Then one evening I got a call from an officer who had taken my statement. They caught a guy, a serial burglar responsible for a string of break-ins around the area. The soles of his shoes matched the prints in my house. The relief was almost overwhelming. For the first time since the intrusion, it felt like Max and I could finally breathe easy. The house, once tainted by the intrusion, slowly morphed into the haven I had envisioned it to be. I made a few security upgrades, of course, reinforcing not just the locks, but also my peace of mind. Story 3. We'll see about that. I used to relish the solitude of the woods, the kind of isolation you can't find anywhere else. Back in the late 80s, before the ease of online bookings, I'd found this cabin through a friend of a friend, a place I could rent for a few days for my hunting trips. Those woods were like a second home to me, a place where I could listen to the birds, watch the morning fog lift off the forest floor, and wait for the chance at a good, clean shot. But that sense of peace was wiped away one autumn, and I still remember that encounter like it was yesterday. It was a morning like any other when it all started, cool and clear with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. I had set out early, eager for the hunt. The forest seemed to welcome me, but the peace didn't last long. As I was propped up against a tree a few hundred yards out from the cabin, a man appeared and took note of me. I pulled my hat off and slowly waved it back and forth to signal my position. Oddly, the man began to approach me. He was rugged, his beard long and gray. As he approached, he walked with an air of ownership over the trees around us. As he got within range of me, I called out a friendly, "Hello," but the man stopped and just looked at me, a look of anger and annoyance on his face. Skipping the formalities, he got straight to his point. "You staying in that cabin up the hill?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Figures," he retorted back. According to him, my rented cabin, and those like me who came from it, had been ruining his hunts for years. "I've been hunting on this land for decades, and ever since that jackass built that cabin out there, random people like you have been coming out here and ruining my hunts." The encounter took me by surprise, but I'm not one to be easily intimidated. I tried to keep the tension from my voice as I explained my position. I had every right to be there, just as he did. But rights seemed a flimsy thing between us, out there in the wilderness. "So that's how it's going to be," he said as he slightly nodded his head up and down, a gesture that to me felt more like a threat than an agreement. "Okay, we'll see about that," he said, before he melded back into the forest, leaving me on edge. The rest of the day was a bust. His words got under my skin, which is probably what he intended. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was in a sour mood and just wanted to sleep it off and try again the next day. My second day in the woods was no better. The deer seemed to have gotten a memo to steer clear of the area. I walked for hours, seeing nothing, the frustration growing with each empty clearing I stumbled upon. By late afternoon, I was ready to pack it in, my mood as dark as the sky was bright. As I made my way back, I saw smoke in the distance. At first, I thought it might just be smoke from a campfire, but the column was too large to just be a simple campfire. I began to realize as well that it was coming from the direction of the cabin. My heart raced as I made my way back, dread growing with every step. As I topped over the hill, my worst fears were confirmed. It was the cabin, ablaze, the smoke billowing out in a thick, choking wave. This was during a time before cell phones, so the only thing that I could do was jump in my truck and head into town to call for help. By the time the authorities, myself and the owner arrived back at the cabin, it was a total loss. The fire was out, but the cabin was gone, the inside gutted by flames. The authorities listened to my story about the other hunter, exchanging looks that said they knew exactly who I was talking about. They left, promising to talk to him. A day or two later, the feedback was as unsatisfying as it was frustrating. The other hunter had claimed to know nothing about it, and the authorities, based on the fire's origin inside the cabin, suggested I had been careless. It was a bitter pill to swallow, being blamed for something I knew wasn't my fault. The owner, faced with the charred remains of what used to be a source of income, decided to tear down what was left. I was convinced that the hunter I'd met was responsible. It seemed like a twisted way to reclaim his territory, by destroying what he saw as an invasion. But with no proof, and only my gut feeling to go on, I was left with nothing but the story of the encounter with the angry hunter. The owner, for his part, believed my story about the man, and never requested any compensation. My gut told me that he had had problems with this individual for quite some time, and the destruction of the cabin wasn't the last of the encounters between those two. Story 4. Headstones. I've never been one to scare easy. You can't be if you've spent half your life trekking through the woods, tracking game. But what I experienced one year, I don't know that I'll ever be able to wrap my head around. To be honest, I don't know that I want to. I was 37 at the time and had just found a new hunting ground. It was deep in the woods of West Virginia. It was untamed, wild, and untapped, or so I thought. I remember the leaves crunched under my boots, and the promise of a good day's hunt filled me with a familiar thrill. But that thrill turned cold when I stumbled upon an unexpected sight in the absolute middle of nowhere. A pair of headstones. They looked to be ancient, dating back to the late 1800s, old and moss-covered, their inscriptions worn away by time and weather. I stood there for a minute just looking at them. As I did, a creepy, unsettling feeling ran over me. It ran straight down my spine and all the way down to the tips of my toes. The woods seemed to fall silent and become heavy, and I felt like I was being watched. It was a feeling I'd never felt in the woods before. Not wanting to stick around any longer, I quickly turned and continued into the woods with my rifle. I walked for probably about 15 minutes before finding a fallen tree to take a quick break on. As I walked, though, the creepiness that I had experienced at the Headstones never left me. I felt like I was being followed, although at the time I never heard or saw anything out of the ordinary. The creepiness reached another level when, during that rest, I swear I began to hear voices. I looked around but saw nothing. Assuring myself that the woods were just playing tricks on me, I grabbed my gun and carried on. I had been in the woods many times before, but this trip definitely felt different. I pressed on, deeper into the woods, putting distance between me and those headstones. But the further I went, the more I couldn't shake the sense that something was following me. Footsteps seemed to echo my own at times, stopping when I stopped, walking when I walked. I scanned the woods around me but never saw anything, at least not right then. I chalked it up to nerves, the headstones playing tricks on my mind. Finally, finding a large, sturdy tree, I settled against it, taking up a watchful position. The forest had come alive again with the sounds of nature, and the eerie feeling began to ebb away. I focused on the hunt, on the rustling of deer through the underbrush, on the distant call of birds. But then, a new sound cut through the calm, a voice, clear and distinct, calling for help. I was on my feet in an instant, rifle forgotten as I scanned the woods for the source. "Hello?" I called out. There was no answer, just the continuous plea for help, repeating over and over like a broken record. The call was faint, but in the middle of the woods, out in the middle of nowhere, it pierced straight into my ears like knives. I moved toward the sound, my heart pounding, wondering who could be out here, wondering if it was a trap. "Help," the voice would say. "Help me." My confusion was quickly turning to terror, as I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every nerve in my body began to shake. "Hello?" I called out again. "Who's out there?" But there was no response. Then, for a minute, it became eerily quiet. Everything stopped, and it's like time stood still. And that's when I saw her. A woman, ghostly pale with hair so white it seemed to almost glow. I stood there, locked onto her, trying to process what I was looking at. She was otherworldly, ethereal, and gave me the coldest fear I've ever felt in my life. She didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but her mouth was open in a silent scream that matched the desperate calls for help echoing around me. I don't remember grabbing my gun or deciding to run, but before I could even realize it, I was sprinting out of the woods with a speed that I didn't know that I had. Branches whipped my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare to look back either. Fear propelled me forward until I reached my truck. There, I gasped for air. The adrenaline was the only thing keeping me from passing out. My lungs were on fire, and I could feel my heart pounding like a jackhammer. I jumped into my truck, peeled out of those woods, and never returned. Honestly, for the most part, I gave up hunting. It's a shame, I used to love it. But every time I stepped foot into any woods, I was taken back to that moment where I saw something that I'll never be able to explain. The encounter opened my eyes to things in this world that society tells us doesn't exist. The hunter became the hunted that day, in my opinion, and that's something that I just can't deal with. Story 5. Broken Antler. I remember this one hunt like it was yesterday. It was cold that day, but the chill didn't bother me. I was warmed by the thrill of the hunt and the heavy gear I carried. I'd been stalking through the dense underbrush since first light. The forest was alive with the usual suspects: chattering squirrels, a distant woodpecker going about his morning routine, the occasional flutter of wings as birds went about their business. But something else was there too, an unsettling feeling that had the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I kept feeling like someone, or something, was watching me, lurking just out of sight. I would hear rustling and see flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye that would disappear just as quickly as it would appear. It was unsettling, but not enough to keep me from my hunt. I reasoned that it was probably just a curious bear. I stayed on alert, but pressed on. After some time, I finally arrived at my spot and settled in. At first it was quiet, but then, through a break in the trees, I saw it. A beautiful buck. It was a magnificent creature, muscular and poised, its antlers a complex tangle of sharp points. I raised my rifle, adrenaline pumping through my veins, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing off the trees, and the buck leapt before bolting. I knew I'd hit it with a perfect shot. I waited for a moment, listening as it trailed off into the distance, then collapsing with a faint thud. As I walked over, I picked up the blood trail. It was clear and bright against the decaying leaves. I followed the trail with a hunter's focus, the excitement of the chase pushing me forward. The blood led me over a ridge. It was there that things took a turn for the bizarre. The trail ended in a pool of blood, but there was no deer. It looked like the deer had fallen, struggled some, and then nothing. It was as if it had been lifted straight into the air. Where in the hell did it go? I thought to myself. I was stumped and scoured the area, but it was as if the earth had swallowed the buck whole. I was so confused. I couldn't understand where it could have gone. With that amount of blood loss, it couldn't have jumped up and walked off. If it was dragged out by a bear or something, there would have been an obvious drag trail on the ground. Unease settled in my stomach as I hiked back to camp. The guys were gathered around the fire, and I recounted my story. They were just as confused as I was. We decided we'd all go out in the morning to look, figuring maybe the animal had somehow, some way, gotten up and moved on despite the injury. We were all experienced hunters, but this just didn't make any sense. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The comforting sounds of crickets and owls was there, but so was that unsettling feeling of being watched that I felt earlier in the day. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the after effects of an adrenaline-filled day. Then, out of the silence came a sound that chilled me to the bone. A strange, bark-like yell, followed by a thud against the canvas of my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and burst outside, expecting to find one of the guys messing around. Instead, I found half of the buck's rack lying there. It wasn't just broken. It looked like it had been torn from the animal's head with incredible force. My voice shook as I called out to the others, and one by one, they emerged from their tents, sleepy and confused. It was clear from their faces they weren't responsible. We sat up the rest of the night, too spooked to sleep, trying to figure out what was happening. At first light, we went back to the ridge. We searched methodically, covering every inch of ground, but it was as if the buck had vanished into thin air. The silence of the forest was unnerving. It felt like even the birds and squirrels were in fear of something. The sense of being watched had intensified, and we all felt it. Whatever this feeling was, it was thick and overwhelming. This feeling, along with the events that had taken place over the past day, was enough to make us want to pack up camp early. We headed out later that day, carrying with us more questions than answers. The mystery of the vanishing deer and the eerie presence that shadowed us during our hunting trip will forever remain unsolved, I guess. Story 6. A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. My girlfriend and I have rented plenty of Airbnbs over the years, but none of the experiences that we've had in any of them compared to the one we had in Florida. We'd been planning this getaway for months, the kind of trip where you leave all your worries packed away in the closet back home and just soak up some sunshine. Florida seemed like the perfect escape, a chance for my girlfriend and I to recharge those rundown batteries of ours. I remember us singing to some old 90s hits on the radio as we cruised down the highway, our spirits as high as the clear blue sky. The Airbnb was a picture-perfect beach house, the kind that you'd swear was plucked straight from a postcard. It had this beautiful little porch with a view that overlooked the ocean, where the waves would roll in hypnotically, and the sand was so white it could have been mistaken for sugar. That first day, we did nothing but laze around on that beautiful beach. The sun was bright, and the breeze felt amazing. It was one of those moments when life felt simple, For me, a guy who's been riding the roller coaster of the financial industry for the better part of a decade, simplicity is something I crave more than anything. In that industry, you're always one decision away from a breakthrough or a breakdown, and the pressure can squeeze you tighter than a size too small suit. The next day was more of the same bliss. As we lounged on the beach, a man approached us. He had his 2 kids in tow, a boy and a girl, both with those innocent smiles that make you think of childhood summers. They ran straight for the water, giggling and kicking up sand. The man struck up a conversation, just friendly chit-chat at first, but then he started asking more personal questions. I've always been a bit too open for my own good, so I found myself telling him about my job, how I've been fortunate enough to climb the ladder, and how it's afforded us the luxuries we sometimes take for granted. He seemed genuinely interested, nodding and asking the kind of questions that encourage you to boast a little. He asked where we were staying, and without a second thought, I pointed out our Airbnb, sitting just behind us. He nodded his head and chatted a little bit more before he wrapped up the conversation, herded his kids up, and headed out. My girlfriend and I didn't give it a second thought. Why would we? The guy had kids with him, and who doesn't like talking about their successes every now and then? Little did we know that our sweet little vacation would go from happiness to horror. As the sun went down, we were back inside our temporary slice of paradise. Around 8 p.m., an unexpected knock rattled the front door. My girlfriend and I exchanged puzzled looks, wondering who it could be. I peered through the peephole and was met with the sight of a stranger. "Hello?" I called out, keeping the door shut. The man on the other side was adamant that he'd rented the place for the night. I explained, as calmly as I could, that he was mistaken, that we'd booked the Airbnb for the entire weekend. But he wouldn't let up, his tone growing more demanding by the second. The man pleaded with me to open the door so that we could discuss the mix-up and get it straightened out. But something didn't feel right. Glancing out the window, I saw a car parked on the street with its engine running. It was too convenient, too suspicious. "Sorry, man, I'm not opening the door," I called out. This did not settle well with the man. He began banging on the door violently and kicking it. The encounter was now sending my girlfriend into a panicked frenzy. That's when I remembered. I'd brought my gun, a precaution I took more out of habit than actual concern for needing it. As the man's knocks grew into heavy bangs, I retrieved my gun. I wasn't looking for a confrontation, just something to tip the scales enough for him to back off. "Call the cops," I said to my girlfriend as I retrieved it, and hurried my way back to the window. There, I tapped it against the window, making sure he saw it. His reaction was immediate. He sprinted to the car, jumping in the back seat. As the car peeled away, I got a glimpse at the driver and another man in the front passenger seat. I couldn't believe what I saw. The man, sitting there in the passenger seat, was the man from the beach. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The questions, the friendly demeanor, it was all an act, a way to scope out potential targets, to catch us off guard. These guys weren't just random opportunists. They were calculated, using a facade of family fun to lower defenses and gather information. When the police arrived, we gave our statement. Turns out, they'd been on the lookout for a group pulling the same con on other tourists. A few weeks later, we heard the news. 3 men arrested, including the guy who'd played the part of the harmless father on the beach. The kids were his niece and nephew, and he was using them as a means to soften his approach to unsuspecting victims, unbeknownst to the kid's mother. It's a strange feeling, knowing you were that close to being a victim of something terrible. It sticks with you. It's a lesson that not every friendly face is what it seems. Anybody could be a wolf in sheep's clothing. Story 7. Vengeful Guest. I've always been a bit of an outdoors guy, but working 60-hour weeks at the office had left me with little time to enjoy the wilderness. That's why when my buddy told me about this cabin in the woods you could rent on Airbnb, I didn't think twice. He said it was a great spot to unwind. So there I was, driving my old Jeep through the dense forest to a place I found online, expecting nothing but the sound of crickets and owls in the night. The cabin was straight out of one of those old wilderness paintings. You know, the ones with the big front porch, a couple of rocking chairs, and that homey feel. I remember pulling up and thinking, this is it. This is perfect. Unloading my stuff, I could feel the stress melting off me with every step I took towards that front door. The first few hours were exactly what I hoped for. I popped open a beer, sat on the porch, and just listened. There was a kind of music to the woods that city life drowns out. As the evening crept in, I grilled a steak and soaked in the solitude. When night fell, I settled in front of the fireplace. The flames flickered and danced, and it was as close to heaven as I'd ever felt. It was cozy, almost hypnotic, but the feeling didn't last. You know that sense you get when you think someone's watching you? I began to feel that, but every time I glanced out the window, I saw nothing, just my own reflection and the dark outline of the trees against the sky. I tried to shake it off and decided to call it a night, hoping sleep would reset everything. But then, just as I was dozing off, I heard a huge bang. It was so loud and sudden, my heart went from 0 to 100 in a blink. I've heard noises in the night before, a branch falling, an animal nosing around. But this was different. This was deliberate. With my heart punching at 100 miles per hour, I approached the door, every horror movie I'd ever seen playing in my head. Opening it, I half expected to be met with some axe murderer's grin. Instead, what I found was a rabbit. It was dead. Its lifeless body looked like it had been thrown there, intentionally. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just a motionless body lying there. It didn't add up. The panic that hit wasn't the adrenaline kind you get when you're pumped. It was cold, heavy. It filled my chest and didn't let go. I felt exposed, vulnerable. After I slammed the door shut and dialed the cops, I spent the next hour pacing around the cabin, every creak and crackle of the woodwork making me jump. The officers who showed up were locals, familiar with the woods and the wildlife. They took a look around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but they came back with nothing. They said it could be kids messing around or someone with a sick sense of humor. They told me to lock up and call again if anything else happened. But even after they left, the sense of security that should have come with their presence just wasn't there. The next day, I reached out to the host, a nice enough guy who seemed as perplexed as I was. He confirmed no one had ever reported anything like this before. Nevertheless, the harrowing ordeal soured my excitement for the retreat, and I canceled the rest of my reservation. As the weeks passed on, the events of that night never left my mind. With curiosity clawing at me, I kept track of the listings' reviews, seeing if anyone had experienced anything similar to what I had. Stories from other guests trickled in, each one with a tale of late-night frights, things just weird enough to make you want to leave and never come back. A few months later, the full picture of what was truly going on out at that cabin came to light. Late one night, the cops pulled over a guy for speeding, not very far from the cabin. As they spoke with the individual, he seemed nervous and erratic. Upon closer inspection of his vehicle, there in the trunk of his car, they found a dead rabbit. After pressing the man for some time, he admitted to being the one behind the disturbances. He was a previous guest, a vengeful guest, who'd had some minor disagreement with the host. His way of getting back was to sabotage the cabin's reputation, to drive guests away with fear, hoping they'd plaster the internet with bad reviews. When I think back on that weekend, my mind is a mix of anger towards the vengeful guest and sadness for the host. It's a story I've shared with some of my friends, a modern-day cautionary tale of how far some people will go over the smallest things. And while I still love the woods, maybe next time, I'll go somewhere with a few more people around, just in case. Story 8. Fog over the farmhouse. When my wife and I initially planned our Austin getaway with close friends, we meticulously picked an Airbnb that seemed perfect for our long weekend, a quaint spot right in the heart of the city, close to bustling bistros and the indie music scene we were so eager to immerse ourselves in. But as luck would have it, a last-minute plumbing catastrophe at our chosen locale left us scrambling for a plan B. Scouring the internet for another place wasn't just frustrating, it was downright stressful, knowing that our well-planned vacation hung precariously in the balance. We finally found a place, though it was a stretch beyond our budget. The listing showcased a modern farmhouse with an aesthetic that seemed straight out of a high-end home magazine. It promised seclusion and tranquility, a stark contrast to our original urban pick, but with our options running low, we took the plunge. The hosts were responsive, and within an hour, we had our new accommodation lined up. Our GPS guided us through the outskirts of Austin until we turned down a gravel path that led to the property. That's when the butterflies in my stomach started fluttering wildly. A towering wrought iron gate stood guard at the entrance, the kind you'd expect at the forefront of some old estate, not a rental property. I felt a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable wariness as I stepped out to punch in the gate code. My eyes couldn't help but wander over to the left, where a small cemetery lay under the shadow of knotted oak trees. The tombstones were weathered and worn, suggesting they'd been there for generations. To our right, a sprawling car junkyard with rusted heaps scattered haphazardly overgrown with Texas sagebrush presented a stark juxtaposition to the deathly silence of the cemetery. The scene was peculiar. Such an odd trio: a cemetery, a junkyard, and a stunning modern farmhouse. As we waited for the gate to draw open, I couldn't shake off the eerie sensation that we were stepping into a chapter of Austin's history that few knew about. When the gate finally creaked open, we drove down the winding path, flanked on both sides by towering fence posts that felt more like sentinels than mere decorations. When the farmhouse came into view, it was as though we'd stepped onto a movie set designed to embody rustic elegance. The wraparound porch was adorned with rocking chairs and hanging plants that swayed gently in the breeze, almost as if greeting us. We grabbed our bags and made our way to the front door, trying to shake off the disconcerting welcome committee we'd just passed. The moment we entered, the feeling of unease began to dissolve. The interior of the farmhouse was breathtaking. The crystal chandelier hanging in the foyer cast a kaleidoscope of light across the walls. The vaulted ceiling soared high above us, and the loft overlooking the living area hinted at cozy evenings. It was clear the house was designed with love, every detail meticulously chosen to create a sense of warmth and luxury. We explored each room with growing excitement, admiring the blend of rustic charm and modern amenities, unaware that the strange occurrences of the night would soon give us a new, less inviting perspective of this beautiful abode. The sun had dipped below the horizon when the charm of the house began to unravel, and a less welcoming ambiance took its place. At first it was the flickering of lights that caught our attention, an occasional dimming that would have been easy to dismiss as a quirk of rural living if not for the precision with which it happened, as if someone were playing with a dimmer switch. We joked about it, making light of the situation, but an unsettling undercurrent ran through our laughter. The noises from outside, too, became a topic of nervous jest. They were peculiar, rustlings and the occasional clank that sounded like it was coming from the junkyard, as if the metallic carcasses were settling in for the night. The unease solidified the next morning when we woke to a landscape swallowed by fog. It was a dense, enveloping fog, the kind that dampens sounds and makes the world feel smaller, more constricted. We had planned to explore Austin that day, but the fog was a thick white curtain, impenetrable and unyielding, delaying our departure. It seemed to press against the windows with an almost sentient force, and I found myself peering into the milky whiteness, half expecting something to be looking back. There was a stillness, a silence that pressed upon our ears, save for the occasional drip of condensation from the eaves. The fog didn't lift until well past noon, and by then, our enthusiasm for venturing out had dampened considerably. That second night, the shift from odd to outright alarming occurred. I had fallen into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by the unmistakable feeling of being touched. It was a firm pressure on my shoulder, like a hand trying to roll me over. I snapped upright, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing there, just the shadowy corners of the room and the soft sound of my wife's breathing, undisturbed beside me. The room felt colder than before, and I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself, trying to convince my racing heart that it was just a dream. But sleep remained elusive. Each creak and groan of the house now felt like a harbinger of something lurking just out of sight. During the days, the attic door would catch my eye, as if it were calling out to be noticed. It sat atop of the loft, inconspicuously placed, but somehow foreboding. The note from the owners echoed in my mind, a seemingly nonchalant request to avoid the attic, which now piqued our curiosity with a morbid sort of allure. Why emphasize this single off-limits area in such a lavishly welcoming home? Each time I passed by the door, a chill would trace the length of my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being closely watched, as though eyes were tracking my every move, bidding their time until curiosity would win out. The mystery of the attic consumed my thoughts. The peculiar old door, with its faded paint and antique handle, seemed to hold secrets just beyond reach. Throughout our stay, the door had been a subtle presence in the back of my mind, an enigmatic piece of the farmhouse's puzzle that the owner's note had turned into an almost forbidden fruit. Their casual warning, intended to deter, had only stoked the flames of curiosity. Was it merely storage, a place for forgotten heirlooms, or something more? I found myself concocting theories, each more outlandish than the last, but the truth remained locked away, just as we were instructed to leave it. That evening, the sense of an unseen presence became overwhelming. As the shadows lengthened and merged, the farmhouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a vessel for something malevolent and watching. The charged air seemed to hum with silent chords of unease. I wrestled with the thought of leaving without exploring the attic, without understanding what lay beyond that door, which seemed to serve as a boundary between the known and the unknown. In the thick of our packing, a small, forgotten photograph fell from between the cushions of the plush sofa. It depicted the farmhouse, or rather, an older, more primitive version of it, standing solemnly in black and white. The people in the picture, a group that could have been a family, bore grim expressions that were common in pictures of the era, but seemed to carry a particular weight here. They were dressed in somber attire, typical of a bygone century, standing rigid and stoic before the house. On the back, scrawled in ink that had faded to a ghost of its original self, were the words, "They don't rest." The message sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but feel as though the eyes of the photographed faces were staring straight through me, their somber gazes heavy with a tale untold. That final night, the house felt like it was closing in on us. The dense fog returned with a vengeance, as if the previous day's phenomenon was just a rehearsal. The fog was a thick shroud outside, more oppressive than ever, and it seemed to leach into the farmhouse, muffling sound and casting everything in a haze. The flickering of the lights escalated into a frenetic dance, leaving us in alternating moments of stark illumination and suffocating darkness. The unexplained noises grew louder, more frequent, and seemed to surround the house. Sounds that I had tried to write off as wildlife or the wind now took on a more desperate quality, a cacophony that seemed to be closing in on us from all sides. They were no longer just the benign settling of an old structure, but carried a sense of intention, as if the house itself was trying to communicate through creaks and groans. It was as if the very essence of the farmhouse was altered, the once welcoming atmosphere replaced by a pressing, ominous dread. Every hair on my body stood on end, a primal reaction to the feeling of being hunted or haunted. Our conversation dwindled to whispers, our movements to cautious steps, the sense of urgency to leave growing with every heartbeat. Sleep was a battle lost before it began. Our last night was spent in a state of vigilance, a long drawn-out moment suspended in the strange energy that enveloped the farmhouse. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own unease, counting the minutes until the sky would begin to lighten. When the first weak rays of dawn finally broke through the fog, we were already packed and ready, the car loaded with a haste born of fear. As we drove away, the house receded into the fog like a specter retreating into oblivion. The tightness in my chest eased with each mile we put between us and the farmhouse, but a cascade of questions remained. We left not with the contentment of a holiday's end, but with the ragged edges of an experience that would haunt us for a long time to come. The relief of departure was tinged with the unease of unresolved mysteries, and the lingering sensation of eyes that might still be watching from the windows of that modern farmhouse, hidden away in the embrace of Austin's foggy outskirts. Story 9. Déjà Vu. The monotony of the night shift at the gas station was my little slice of peace, a place where the most excitement I expected was the occasional drifter passing through, or the rumble of a late-night trucker. There's one night, though, that I'll never forget. A shift that started just like any other, but ended up being anything but ordinary. It was a typical night. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was killing time flipping through a car magazine when, at the stroke of midnight, the bell above the door announced a customer. He was an average-looking guy, but dressed strangely in a thick, heavy coat that seemed out of place for a night that called for a light jacket at best. His eyes darted around the store before settling on me, and he approached the counter with a hesitant step. "Can you tell me how to get to Smithville?" he asked. You'd think in this day and age that any phone could easily pull up any location and give you turn-by-turn directions anywhere. But not wanting to engage in too much conversation with the guy, I elected not to say anything about it, and figured it'd just be easier to give him the directions and send him about his way. "Sure," I said, laying down the magazine. "You're going to take a left out of the parking lot. Follow the road for about 15 miles, then you'll see the sign. Can't miss it." He nodded, thanked me, and turned to leave, but not before I heard him muttering under his breath. It was too low for me to catch the words, and I was left with a small amount of unease. But hey, people are odd, and working nights you see a fair share of odd. An hour passed, uneventfully, and the digital clock on the wall read 1 a.m. That's when the bell chimed again, and if I hadn't known better, I'd have sworn I was experiencing déjà vu. The same guy, same coat, same uncertain gait. He came up to the counter with no sign of recognition, and asked, "Can you tell me how to get to Smithville?" "You just asked me that," I said, my confusion edging into my voice. "An hour ago? Don't you remember?" He blinked, a perfect picture of bewilderment. "Come again?" he said. "Weren't you in here an hour ago asking me the same question?" I said. "I think I'd remember if I had been here before," he replied. I was confused, but like before, I wasn't up for conversation, so I provided the directions again. He took the directions once again, this time with a nod and that same indecipherable mutter. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was feeling the kind of creeped out that you can't shake, that gets under your skin. Sure enough, like a clock striking the hour, he was back. The same question, the same coat, the same everything. I confronted him, saying, "Look, man, this isn't funny. You've been here twice asking for the same thing." The guy fixed me with a stare, a blend of confusion and something else, something darker. "Buddy, this is the first time I've ever seen you," he said, but the sincerity in his voice was as thin as tissue paper. He left once again, but this time I was locked in, focusing hard on what the man had been muttering under his breath the last few times he left. As he left with a repeat of his now familiar muttering, a cold dread settled in my stomach. "See you soon," I heard him whisper. This was no longer just strange, it was alarming. 3 a.m. couldn't come fast enough, and with it, a resolution formed sharp and clear in my mind. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for whatever this was to escalate. I locked the door, a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there, but it was something. An hour later, right on cue, he came back, but this time the locked door stopped him. "Hey man, unlock the door," he said. "I need to get some directions." "Hell no," I replied back. The transformation was immediate. The average Joe with the too heavy coat became a maniac. He started pounding on the door, cursing at me with an expression of rage and desperation. "I need to know how to get to Smithville," he screamed, his voice unhinged. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told him, "I can't help you, man." He continued to shout and bang on the door, his face a mask of fury, his eyes wild. That's when I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I explained the situation. The police arrived within minutes, but the man had vanished into the night as if he had never been there. They took my statement, their brows creased in concern, or maybe skepticism, and suggested drugs or mental illness might be at play, but nothing about this felt that simple. When the sun came up and the morning crew arrived, I was still there, a complete wreck from the events of the night. They found me rattled, recounting the night's events as if saying them out loud would make sense of it all. But it didn't. Nothing about that night or the multiple encounters with the man made any sense. I requested to not work any more night shifts alone in that gas station anymore. At first, management was accommodating, but as time went on, the request became more and more difficult to fulfill. Ultimately, I ended up having to find a new job. That night has stayed with me. Who in the hell was that man? Was he just trying to freak me out? What was his true intentions? Something tells me the man never made it to Smithville. Something tells me he never had any intentions of ever going there in the first place. Story 10. The Manager's Warnings. I remember it clearly. The day I walked into that job interview for the night security guard position at a local department store. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, something to fill the nights and pad the wallet. The store was an old structure, with walls that held decades of commerce. The manager, an old man with eyes full of years of experience, seemed almost reluctant to hire me. As we sat across from each other in the break room, the smell of stale coffee hanging in the air, he laid it out straight. "We've had a few incidents," he said, his voice lowering as if the very walls around us could hear. "Movement, shadows, things that fall off shelves with no explanation, and sounds, strange sounds that don't belong. Nobody has ever been hurt, but for some, it's a little bit too much to handle." I raised an eyebrow. "So the place is haunted, huh?" I asked, chuckling a little bit. He didn't smile. Instead, he offered a nod. "Believe what you will, but I feel like it's my duty to tell you beforehand. I wasn't a believer in such things. I'd outgrown the fear of the dark. I didn't believe that monsters, ghosts, and goblins were hiding in the shadows. So I accepted the job, my chuckle masking the tiny flicker of doubt that maybe, just maybe, I was stepping into something I couldn't control. The first night arrived, and with it, a sense of nervousness I hadn't expected. The store was different at night, devoid of the comforting hustle of daytime activity. It was just me, my heavy boots echoing on the linoleum floors, the hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the silent atmosphere of 1,000 unsold goods watching me. I took my post at the security desk, a tiny island in a sea of shadows. Monitors flickered with the black and white ghosts of empty aisles and mannequins dressed in the latest fashions. It was on these screens that I first saw it. A flicker of movement that had no source. A flutter that could have been a trick of the light, but felt like so much more. I tried to ignore it, to immerse myself in the routine checks of the cameras, the sip of lukewarm coffee, the flip through a worn magazine. But it felt like the store was watching me with eyes that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. It was when I heard a clatter, a sound like metal on tile, that my resolve began to crumble. I found myself drawn into the heart of the store, my flashlight cutting a swathe through the darkness. The aisles were vast, the shelves towering above me like silent lookouts. There, in the middle of the floor, lay a toy, a small metal car. It was completely out of place, just laying there, like it had been placed there. I told myself it was nothing, just something that had fallen off the shelf. No big deal. I bent down to pick it up. As I placed it back onto the shelf, a cold tingle ran over my skin. I tried to laugh it off, chiding myself for letting the manager's earlier warning get into my head. Settling back into my post, all was quiet for a short time. But then, out of nowhere, the lights began to flicker. I could feel it. I was alone, but not alone. It felt like someone, or something, was studying me. I felt like I needed reassurance, a way to prove to myself that it was all in my head. So, I returned to the floor of the department store, seeking out something that would provide me with the reassurance that I needed. That's when I saw the balloons, a cluster of them tied to an end cap, bobbing gently in the air, that I was now acutely aware had no current. With bravado I didn't feel, I issued my challenge to the empty store. If there's something here, some spirit or ghost, then pop one of those balloons. I waited, my heart pounding in a frantic rhythm. I stared at the balloons, listening, waiting. After a moment, I felt like the reassurance I was seeking had arrived. There was nothing, only silence. Wiping a thin layer of sweat off of my forehead, I gave myself a chuckle and started walking back towards my post, Before I could pivot, though, there was a sudden explosion from one of the balloons. It was as sudden as a lightning strike. The sound of the burst was deafening in the quiet, like a cannon blast that reverberated through the aisles and off the shelves. In that instant, my courage shattered. I didn't hesitate, didn't stop for anything. I left my post, the store, the job, all behind in a heart-pounding sprint for the door. I didn't even bother to lock it behind me. I never went back, not even to explain. But I don't think any explanation was needed. It's a situation I feel that the manager of the store has encountered before. It wasn't his first, and I certainly don't think that it'll be his last. For a few nights after that incident, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, that single loud pop still echoing in my ears. I tell myself it was just a balloon, that it was the pressure or a defect that made it burst. But in the dark of the night, when the world is silent and still, I wonder if I had been too quick to dismiss the manager's warnings. Story 11. Worked too hard. Let me tell you about this one night that I won't be forgetting anytime soon. It was a night like any other, or so I thought, when I clocked in for my cleaning shift at the downtown offices. The building was as quiet as a tomb, just the way it always was at night. I started from the top and worked my way down, floor by floor, with nothing but the hum of the air conditioning for company. By the time I hit the 4th floor, it was around 1 a.m. I unlocked the door and pushed my cart through, expecting the usual silence, but instead, I was greeted by this soft, yet creepy moaning sound. It was faint, coming from the far corner of the floor. My heart started pounding right away. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to get a friendly response back, but there was no answer. I thought maybe I was just tired hearing things. But then there it was again, a moan, clearer this time. Now I'm not one to scare easy, but something about that sound made my hair stand straight up. I stood there for a good minute, trying to decide if I really wanted to know what was making that noise. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. Slowly moving past the cubicles, the moaning got louder and louder. As I crept towards the back of the office, I saw something that absolutely terrified me. I could make out a shadowy figure swaying in the back corner. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, but all I got back was another moan. At this point, this became too much for me, and every instinct told me to turn tail and get out of there. I turned and began to make my way out, but just as I did, I heard a thud, like someone had just dropped a load of books, and the moaning got louder. I froze for a second, then turned around expecting, I don't know what. But the figure was gone. I could still hear soft moans and murmurs, though. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided I had to know what was going on. Maybe it was concern. Maybe it was the fear of not knowing. Any rational person would have left and called security by now, but there I was, creeping closer to where I'd seen the figure. As I neared the back of the office, what I saw was unexpected to say the least. There, in the dim light from the exit sign, I saw feet. I was confused, terrified, panicked, and worried all at the same time. Was this a trap to lure me in closer, or was there someone there that truly needed help? I swallowed hard and moved closer. Finally, I could see that it was a man, all dressed up in a suit, lying there on the floor. I recognized him. He was one of those high flyers from the legal department, always glued to his phone. But there he was, flat out on the carpet, looking nothing like the sharp guy who barely gave me a nod when I passed him in the hallway. He was pale, sweating like he'd run a marathon. I called security right away, and they came running. They called an ambulance, and he was taken away to the hospital. I later learned that the man had been under a lot of stress, popping pills for anxiety. He'd been trying to catch up on work, meet some impossible deadline, and had taken one too many of a cocktail of drugs. That night, I saw firsthand what a job and what stress can do to a person. I finished cleaning the floor in silence, thinking about the man and the pressure he must have been under. It was the scariest thing I've ever encountered, the sounds in the corner of the office, the shadowy figure swaying back and forth. It was a lot for my system to try to process, working alone in the dead of the night. As I locked up the building before dawn, I couldn't help but think about how thin the line is we all walk between keeping it together and falling apart. For the man, I guess sometimes the scariest things in life aren't shadows and moans, but battles that come from inside.